Welcome back. Aisling, you were talking before the break about how dangerous is such kind of warfare. Now, how could one protect his society or his people against such kind of warfare?
As I said,
it's very difficult to understand that what is right and what is wrong, and who to believe and who not to believe.
This is part of the aim. The aim is to create a kind of false narrative,
a disarray,
picture, a disarray, and anyone who's a critic or tries to expose this, what's happening, is in the Western press they're called Assad's useful idiots. So even very credible journalists like Seamus Milne, the point is if you take a critical line, they try to shut you up and try to dismiss your argument. And I think it was Brzezinski who said, look, because he's criticised the idea of foreign intervention in Syria, and he's argued in many articles, you know, this is just stoking the fires of what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s. And he said, you know, I'm not trying to defend brutality, I'm not trying to defend, there have been atrocities carried out by both sides. That's clear, that's what happens in war.
In wars,
and this is what happens in civil war. No one's trying to defend it. The point is that there are many cases when the West doesn't intervene. And why is Syria a particular case? And what they've tried to show is to create a narrative whereby there's this humanitarian justification and urgent need. And what you see in many phases of the conflict in Syria, the siege on Homs and the few foreign journalists who were in there, and the last dispatch by Marie Colvin before she was killed, you know, it very much focuses on these innocent children, babies, mothers who are being killed by these brutal forces, government forces. It's much more complicated than that. Syria, as we know, it's very much a kind of preparation for a war on Iran to weaken Syria. I'm not sure whether the aim is for President Assad to fall or to actually just weaken Syria. Syria, in many
Syria
cases,
already weakened?
Syria has been weakened, of course. I mean, Syria has been, it's almost like Iraq take two. Syria has been led down the path of sectarian civil war. And this has been instigated by the West with their Gulf partners. I'll give one example from Syria again. The Time magazine did a story in September. They were looking at how the weapons provided from the Gulf by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are facilitated through Turkey, through an operations room in Istanbul, the kind of problems on the ground between the groups, and how some of the weapons are being distributed by a Lebanese parliament member from the Future Movement, and others just on the kind of dynamics between the different jihadist, Muslim Brotherhood, Free Syria army groups in Idlib. And another journalist who was writing about the same thing also was showing how even amongst the armed groups there's competition in terms of this info war.
There's a conflict, actually.
When he was there, he was with and he's been based with different insurgent groups, the Al-Farouk Brigade and others around Homs. Another group was filming operations that were undertaken by the Al-Farouk Brigade and claiming responsibility, because apparently the weapons in the north of Syria are distributed according to how many hits you have on YouTube and how many sort of sensational videos you can upload on YouTube. So these groups are effectively fighting amongst each other. They all have a PR.
They also want to win the information warfare.
They need to win the information warfare because they only get the weapons and the bullets and the RPGs.
And the money, perhaps, or the funding.
And the money, if they successfully show that they're able to carry out these operations. So even if it's not a successful operation in terms of targeting the Syrian government or if it doesn't have any military significance, it's significant the fact that they do a very, you know, graphic, sophisticated, sensational YouTube video.
Aisling, under such kind of circumstances, how can one respond to such kind of warfare?
I think what's important is people like us who are against this regime change project in Syria and who are trying to show what actually is happening. You have to really monitor the media carefully. It's very easy actually to see through a lot of this very humanitarian narrative that, you know, for example, in Britain, the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, every day is making statements, you know, we have this moral authority, you know, we have to show that we're better than this, there's this imperative to intervene. And it's to point out the hypocrisies. For example, in Libya, NATO refused to accept there were any civilian casualties from all the bombing raids on Libya. They said if we don't define it as if we haven't investigated this as a casualty and proved it was a casualty, then it doesn't exist as a casualty. In Syria, so they've refused to accept, and the New York Times and Human Rights Watch did do research into this issue and showed that of course there were civilians killed. There was something like 9,000 sorties carried out. And there are very clear cases of where whole families were killed. But NATO, the point is NATO refused to accept there were any casualties.
Right.
In Syria, just to say, in Syria what we have on the other hand is that the British government and other Western governments are funding documenting centres, and they keep saying we're keeping records because of future war crimes cases that we can bring against President Assad and his government. You know, the hypocrisy of this. So it's really important to monitor the press and to watch out. There's a flourishing alternative press.
But you know, these counterfeit videos are not only used by the groups and the armed groups, but also used by prominent TV networks.
Yeah, there's been many, and this is the other thing. I think the coverage of the whole Arab awakening, and particularly the Syria, which is cast in the West as a popular uprising against an authoritarian government. There are elements of that, but it's much more than that. I used to work in northern Syria near Aleppo in 2 Palestinian refugee camps with the UN, and you know, there's a lot of corruption, people are very poor. There's a dire need of serious social, political, economic reforms in Syria. But the point is, this is not about reform. The Saudi Arabia and Qatar are certainly not fighting for the overthrow of the Syrian government.
Is this
because they want to have a sort of democratically elected government in Syria? They're certainly not. They're fighting because this, again, is part of the war in Iran, and they want to install a Saudi-influenced government.
Is this
which
why
would
you
be
are
accountable
against the
to
regime
them.
change in Syria?
The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has said that why Syria is so important is because how the conflict in Syria is solved will determine how future conflicts are solved. The West and their allies, as they did in Libya, they set up a Friends of Syria, Friends of Libya group to bypass the UN Security Council and effectively to sort of implement a regime change project, bypassing any opponents. In Syria it hasn't worked. Russia and China have consistently resisted any attempt at forceful intervention in Syria, even whether it's under the pretext of humanitarian corridors or no-fly zones or...
Yes. Allow me to go back to the issue of the information warfare, and at the heart of this information warfare is the proxy human rights organizations. How effective are these organizations, and how to stand in face of such kind of organizations and just let the people know?
In some ways they've been very effective. I mean, in the West the narrative has been created that this is, you know, the President Assad's government killing unarmed protesters who are protesting against authoritarian rule in Syria.
For the sake of reform.
For the sake of reform and democracy, etc. And most people believe this. Increasing numbers don't believe it, and I think with the increasingly apparent failures in Iraq, in Afghanistan, people just don't trust this kind of simplistic narrative. The trouble is, a lot of people in the media and in certain think tanks, they are very closely aligned with this regime change project. So you have organizations like the ICG, the International Crisis Group, calling for arming of the opposition in Syria. I mean, this is illegal. It's it's illegal under the UN Charter to arm forces for toppling a sovereign government. And for example, the leader of the opposition in Turkey, Frank Logolu, has said, you know, he's been very vocal saying what the Turkish government doing is illegal. This is violating the sovereignty of a neighboring country. But the narrative is sort of couched in these humanitarian terms, so that it creates this public support in the West for... So the important thing is to counter this narrative, and whether it's by human rights groups, you know, some of us were saying from the start that there were activists who were creating these videos. Demonstrations were held in Syria solely that they could be videoed and put up on the website. They lasted like 1 or 2 minutes.
How can one respond to these?
Well, it's important to...
How can one stop their effect?
by exposing the hypocrisy, the lies, the fake videos, by exposing all of this and exposing how this is part of, and really challenging the media. You know, even the use of the word regime, they use the Syrian regime. Now in the Western media, they'll never say the Saudi regime. It's the Saudi government. And a report, an independent report done by the BBC Trust, which looked at the BBC's coverage of the Arab awakenings, they raised this as a question. They said, you know, why does the BBC use the word regime for Syria, but not for Saudi Arabia or Qatar?
Yes.
You never hear the word Qatari regime.
Yes.
You know, it's the Qatari government or
true.
the Saudi government.
What can you tell us about the evolution of the color revolution techniques, and what and where is next on the list? Quickly, if I may ask.
I think the color revolution, it had a very specific context in Eastern Europe, and you need to look at how it brought about the sort of neoliberal economic project for Europe. So it's important to kind of deconstruct what the color revolution kind of handbook and toolbox is, and how it's been used in different places. In Iran it was used, you know, hugely, and the Green Movement received something like $450 million. The Green Movement itself, but other NGOs working, media activists in the US. So we've had one wave of this, and it failed in Iran. It could well likely happen again in the next Iranian elections, and no doubt NGOs will play a key part of this. Human rights groups, Amnesty, and although Amnesty and Human Rights Watch on Syria have done reports critical of the Syrian opposition and the insurgents, their overall message is, you know, we've got to intervene, we've got to do something. And this is very much, this is similar to John McCain and all the neocons, you know. So the human rights organizations, I think we need to really closely look at what they're arguing. And where next? Probably Iran in 2013, when the next presidential elections happen, or 2014.
The way it happened in 2009, but it failed, apparently.
It failed, but it will happen again, and I think Russia is also a key target. And it's interesting to note that in September, the Russians kicked out US aid. They asked US aid to leave Russia, even though they were funding, you know, a couple of $1 billion, I think, of aid over some years. The role played by NGOs recently in the election of President Putin, they've realized that, you know, some NGOs play a very dubious role.
Right. Aisling Byrne, researcher and project coordinator at Conflicts Forum. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
إذن